All right. Hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Learning and Growing 2021 presentation, Affirming Gender and Sexuality Identities in the Remote Classroom. My name is Shriver Hasbrook, and I'm a member of the training and support team here at Hawks Learning, and our presenter today is Colleen Clemens. Professor Clemens has been teaching for 25 years and has taught from middle school to graduate school. She's an English professor with focus on global Anglophone texts, and the Director of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Kutztown, University of Pennsylvania. Now, we will have a live Q&A session with Professor Clemens today, so please enter any questions that you have into the Q&A area at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll be able to get to all of those at the end of the presentation. On that note, I will go ahead and hand it over to our presenter, so the floor is yours, Professor Clemens.
Thank you, and thank you all for spending an hour with me during your time perhaps off. And I will say, that just like I'm at home, so I've got my, pup at my feet, and hopefully we won't get distracted. But if we do, I apologize in advance. So as you just heard, I've been teaching a very long time, and just like everyone else probably on this call, this past year really was different than everything else. So this is a specific webinar about remote classrooms. And while I know that immediate remote classroom experience may be going away, I don't think this is going away forever. So even if we're not all teaching online like maybe we were in the past academic year, I hope that you find something really valuable and useful in this hour together. I very much want you to ask questions, and you can ask them in the middle. You don't have to wait till the end. And I apologize if I'm talking about something that you do already know, and appreciate your patience and understanding that I want to make sure everybody knows some of these things. So let's get started. So the first thing I always want to say about this is that we are all in this together. So just because I think about this a little more than maybe you do, that doesn't mean I know the answers to everything. It doesn't mean that I'm not always growing. 10 years ago when I taught my first, it was called Women's Studies then, and in 10 years it's become Women and Gender Studies, and then Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies at our university. I had never heard the word transgender, and I have a degree in this, and it was a word that a student introduced to me. So, my learning curve is there just along with everyone else. So I never want anybody to feel as if you already should know something. That's why we're here. That's why we all learn together, and we all grow as teachers together. So I hope that you definitely don't feel, you should feel glad that you're here, and I'm glad that you're here. And as I said before, please do stop. I think that if you would hop in and moderate, like if you see a question pop up in the middle, that would be great. But also we can wait until the end, because I know that we have questions about these things. So my driving questions for what we're doing today, let me move the bar. Anybody else never noticed that your Zoom bar is always in the worst place? There we go. Is how do students know that we are allies and advocates and accomplices, if you like that word, if they have never been in a classroom with us? So a lot of us have reputations in our school already. A lot of us, this past year, some of the students knew us already, but some of us didn't. And so if that reputation of being an ally, accomplice, advocate isn't already there for your students, how do we show them that in a remote space? And how do we affirm these identities in virtual spaces? And we could do a whole other hour on physical spaces, but just thinking about those virtual spaces that we all entered this year. And frankly, why does all of this matter, right? And I would argue that it matters a great deal. So just really quickly, a little primer on the terminology that I'm using. So sex and gender are two different things. When we say sex, we're usually talking about sex assigned at birth. Gender is how we feel about ourselves. And sexuality then is necessarily like what I have a 9-year-old daughter who's always trying to make sense of this. And she's trying to always make sense of like gender and sexuality. And really reductively, I tell her, Gender is how you feel about yourself, and sexuality is like how you feel about others. So those terms I know have been pulled apart more and more, thank goodness, but just in case, we need to be thinking about those terms a little bit. And then sexuality, right? We immediately become overwhelmed by the amazing fluidity of sexuality that has always been there, but suddenly we are all so much more present and aware of. I will always say that the biggest change that I have seen in my 25 years of teaching is the change in attitudes about sexuality, about anything that's beyond heterosexuality. I remember being a very staunch advocate for these issues in 1997 when I started teaching, and I was the anomaly. And I think I still have students that really appreciated that. But now I think it's just the air we breathe. And if there's one biggest change in my teaching career that makes me most excited, it is attitudes about sexuality and gender. We have a long way to go. But so when I'm talking about sexual identity or sexuality, here are a few. You might see students wearing like a lapel pin or something with one of these on. Do not be upset if you don't know what every single one of these words means. I will tell you the story of, I had a student, a former student, who came out on Facebook just this morning as something, and I had never seen it before. So I just Googled it, and then I was like, okay, that makes sense. So don't feel like you need to know what every single one of these words means. That's not necessary in order to be a good ally. To be a good ally is to just know how to find that information and not necessarily put the responsibility on the person to share that information with you. Just got to know how to do the work, which if you're in the seminar, you probably already do. And as always, having an intersectional approach, meaning we think about these different identity markers, how oppression and marginalization might intersect. So I would encourage you to think about what we talk about today with other identities. If you are particularly interested in focusing on racial identities this year, a lot of the things I talk about, you can transfer some of the things, the practical things we're going to do. It'll just look different, but the same idea is behind it. So though we're talking about mostly like LGBT issues today, this can translate into anything. So I want you to feel empowered to use these tools on your own for anything that you care about. So right when COVID began, there were several pieces about how to specifically support our LGBT students because of the very specific needs that this population was going to experience. Again, I would argue these didn't disappear just because most people might be back in the classroom. I would argue that hopefully these students have come back to us, but that they still very much are an issue. So this is kind of the big why, right? Why is it important when we are in our virtual spaces to ensure that students know that we care about them? So of course, the lack of connection that everyone felt, students that might have been in an affinity group or just had someone on their campus or in their classroom that they knew that they could trust, suddenly disappeared. So while everybody experienced that, I think to some degree, our LGBTQ students may have and continue to experience that more deeply. And again, like clubs, just all those things that if a student has reached out for, the guidance counselor, any kind of social service, there's just so many things. And at the same time may have been then in a space where they weren't out or they were unsupported. I'm guessing some of you had these experiences with students who were very unhappy being back in their homes. They had I teach college, but even with high school, I think but with college kids, They finally got out in some way, some of them feel, and then to have that taken back so quickly from them put several of my students in precarious positions. And also housing instability, which again, we see on a huge scale just in the United States alone. But that housing instability often directly affects more proportionally students who are LGBT youth. Excuse me. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. So that lastly, that feeling of postponement, that feeling of maybe I have students say to me so often, like, I finally feel at home here, I finally feel seen. And that can be for a bunch of reasons, not just sexuality or gender, and then not having that anymore. So all of those things are reasons that we need to be thinking about our virtual spaces so that our students know we care about them. Our trans students specifically may have had their gender affirming medical interventions disrupted. I know it feels like ancient history now when we couldn't go to the doctor unless it was for something that was considered necessary. But students who are in the process of those gender affirming medical interventions, those things may have been disrupted. Maybe they haven't been able to start again. So our trans students may be dealing with that as we come back into the classrooms and as we kind of come into this, whatever the next stage is. And again, being misgendered, right? That aggression of being misgendered, maybe they're somewhere where they can't be out anymore. So for all these reasons, thinking about our students and what that extra layer of how they are impacted here through COVID and beyond. And I want to remind you that what you do is so important because so often our classrooms are the safest space for our students with marginalized identities. So how do students know that we are those people without the sticker on the office door or just being in class and being able to talk to us one-on-one or having that reputation follow us for students who haven't even been to campus yet and are now sophomores. So bravo for being here, bravo for thinking about this, and remembering that how important we are as teachers to these students. I want you to always assume that there are trans students in your classroom. This is something that I am continually reminded of. I have a friend a student that I worked with for years who came out to me last summer, and I'm embarrassed that I was surprised, but it reminded me how important it is to be always out front and always being open about these issues, because the person you least expect might be the one hearing you say this. And transgender youth need us to be supportive. So you can see almost 2%, and this is from the CDC, almost 2% of high school students identify as trans, and 27% feel unsafe going to school. 35% are bullied at school, and I think we all know the high attempt at dying by suicide that this population faces. I was reading another study this morning that was about discipline, which I had never thought about before, about even like the discipline in your schools. LGBT youth often have a higher percentage of discipline issues because they don't go to school because they're bullied or harassed. And so we need to be the face. We need to say, you're not going to bully here. We need to make sure that our staff knows how to talk about these things. And we need students to know that they can come to us. So always assume, especially if no one's out. And if somebody does come out to you, that's a whole other webinar as well. But there's a good chance that folks are hearing and watching what you say. And and you might not even realize the impact of it. So this is a question I get really often. Grab a sip of water here. So I'm cisgender. So what that means is that my sex assigned at birth and my gender identity align. Cis means same. Trans, the word transgender comes from trans, meaning across, meaning somebody's sex that they were assigned at birth is not the same as their gender. Again, being super reductive here, happy to talk more about these terms. So I'm cis, right? So why should I be doing all this work? And the first thing is that we need to normalize these things. We just need to make them part of the air. Coming up, we'll talk about pronouns in a moment. Language matters. It doesn't take a lot of effort to show that it is just quote unquote normal to share your pronouns. Again, those students are watching. They may never say to you that they're benefiting directly, but we know they are, because it is creating that climate where students feel safe, and we know students need to feel safe in order to learn. The other thing is that, and this kind of goes for every marginalized population, is that often that population, the onus is on them to fix the problem. And so, that should not be the case. Folks who are in marginalized positions should not have to be doing all of the effort to undo their marginalization. So by me as a cis person stating my pronouns just everywhere, basically, and I don't make a big deal about it, but just having it there, it helps us show students that this is a gender inclusive space. I don't need like trumpets and fanfare. I just need to create this climate where this is the way it is, without ever overtly even saying, I am an ally. So how do we do this? What are some very practical, because I know we're all busy and it's hard to add in one more thing. So I promise you, none of this takes much time, but it has significant benefits. So how do we identify ourselves as allies and accomplices in a virtual space? And I want to step to the side here for a moment, because I was a secondary educator, and I want to say very openly that I know not all climates are the same. And so you also need to, take risks that you feel safe with, but also I get, because I was a high school English teacher for many years, some of this might not translate into what you're able to do. And so you finding your own path in the climate that you are in. These were things that worked for me, but having had a foot in secondary ed public school and then a public university, I know those climates are very different, especially right now. So please know that I don't want this to be prescriptive. I don't want you to feel like, oh, I can't do that, so I'm not doing the work. You absolutely are. In fact, if you're showing up in a climate that does not feel conducive to this, I think I would argue you're doing the harder work than I am, because it's easy to do this stuff when you're the director of women's gender and sexuality studies. So please know, I want you to also feel safe when you do these things. My dog is snoring. I know this seems so obvious, but just loving our students and letting them know that we are loving, caring people is probably the most effective thing you can do. And the reason I put under there, it is okay to make mistakes, is it is, because you're trying. Perfect example is I've had a student whose gender identity through the time I've known her was male, non-binary, and female, right? I am going to make mistakes. We're going to make mistakes. And so if we can just make those mistakes graciously, and not make it about ourselves, right? Oh my God, I'm so sorry. No, just I'm sorry, I'm going to do better. That if we come at this from a place of respect and love, that's going to shine through. So even if everything else feels like it's faltering, in my experience, that if they know that we care about them, if we aren't perfect all the time, they're going to still appreciate the efforts we are making. As you know, some folks are not making the effort, and so that makes it even more important for us to make it. So let's talk about pronouns, because first of all, as an English professor, I think pronouns are terrible, just in general, because half the time people don't know what they're standing in for. So just grammatically, but pronouns really, really matter. Do they matter in my world? No, because I'm cisgender, and so things just feel really easy. But they matter in the bigger climate of what we're trying to create, which is this gender inclusive space. This is one of my favorite images. It's actually the top image of my, we use D2L, Blackboard, whatever. This is the top image that I have on my WGS classes. I just love it. But so let's talk a little bit about pronouns. So I'm just going to read this because I think it's elegantly stated. This is from mypronouns.org. It's a great site. There's so many great resources. The hard part of putting together things like this is often, what do I choose to share? Every path could be another hour. How do I decide to have this conversation and not that? But I do really like this. So using someone's correct personal pronoun is a way to respect them and create an inclusive environment, just as using a person's name can be a way to respect them. So I'll pause for a second. The post-colonial scholar in me will say, right, the importance of like pronouncing a student's name right. It always breaks my heart when I have a student who doesn't have an Anglophone name, and they're like, oh, you can just call me this. I'm like, no, I want to call you by your name. It is a sign of respect. So just as it can be offensive or even harassing to make up a nickname for someone and call them that nickname against their will, it can be offensive or harassing to guess at someone's pronouns and refer to them using those pronouns if that is not how the person wants to be known. Or worse, actively choosing to ignore the pronouns someone has stated that they go by could imply the oppressive notion that intersex, transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people do not or should not exist. Language matters. We construct our identity and meaning through language. So while these little 3 and 4 letter words seem like throwaways, they're not. They really do matter to specifically our trans community in our schools. So here's some practical things that I do to create that inclusive virtual space. Excuse me, Calvin. There we go. I do a first day survey. I use our online learning tool, which is D2L. You could use Google survey, and it is super basic. This is the first thing I do in every class, not just WGS classes. I do all these things in all of my classes because, again, I don't want to compartmentalize these issues, that these are like WGS issues, and in the rest of the world, it doesn't matter. I do this in all my classes because, again, we assume we have students that this matters to. And I always have a student who writes to me and thanks me in this survey for asking this question. So on the first day, however, whatever tool you like to use, it could even be a note card. It doesn't have to be online if you're in a physical space. It shows that you care immediately about gender issues and helps you collect data if your school records do not affirm gender identities. If you are like me at a university, it may be only in the past year or two that the records that we receive as instructors match the records of what the student wants. I'll tell you a way that I learned about that, right? So I used to print out attendance sheets for the first day of class that I would circulate, and it used to have their first and their last name. And I had a student who crossed out what the first name was and put in their correct name. And from then on, I just printed it out with last names and a blank for the first name so that they could put it in. Just little things like that, that administratively that are maybe not supported yet at your school. It took a lot of work to have people's correct names affirmed throughout. And I still, I had a trans student who wrote to me and asked if I knew, this is a great example, right? Like, once you're an ally, I hadn't had the student for years, but wrote to me and asked if their diploma was going to have the correct name on it. And my answer was, I don't know, but I will find out for you. And they were like, no, you don't have to. I'm like, absolutely. Again, I will do that. So I reached out to the registrar to confirm that the correct name was translated into the diploma. Things like that we maybe, if you're cisgender, have never thought about. What would it be like to be handed a diploma with there's lots of terms for your dead name, or, this name that isn't who you are. So I simply ask, I think I see a question. So somebody asked about their pronouns. And that's a good question, Sal. I don't know how to make this go away. There we go. Nope. Give me a sec. So Sal asked, I heard trans youth say they don't want to be asked about their pronouns. So here is what I would say to that. I would never say to a student, what is your pronoun? Ever. I just try to get rid of them from my language, which is really hard. However, with this is everybody. So it's not me singling somebody out. And I say to students, I'm like, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to. So I just ask them 2 questions. What is your name? If this is different than the records, tell me. And this could also be a place for a nickname. I tell them that. I'm like, what do you want me to call you? So it's not necessarily about gender, that first question. And then, what are your pronouns? And I have this little phrase here, right? If you've never thought about this before, because most 17, 18-year-olds, a lot of them have never thought about this question before. Somebody who's trans has thought about this question all the time. They know what that question means. So I've never had the experience where someone has had a problem doing this survey, ever. That is not, maybe they have and they just didn't say it. But one-on-one. So the only time I openly ask for pronouns, and this is going a little on a tangent, but is when I am writing a letter of recommendation. So when I agree to write a letter of recommendation, I do ask the student for their pronouns. So I take back that I say I never did it. That is the one time I do, because I want that letter to be right. And I want that letter to immediately, signal to the reader who this person is. I'm trying to think if there's any other time I would know. Or when a student is like coming out to me, I would ask them, if we're changing things, I would say that. But in this situation, especially, and both of those situations are like when students have come to me for something, but generally I would not be like, what's your pronoun? So it's a good question. And I'm just working on my own experience. There might be somebody who has said, I can't believe Dr. Clemens asks us this. Going on my experience of trying to figure these things out along with everybody else. Email signatures. I really saw a nice, elegant way to handle this the other day in somebody's email signature, that instead of having like she/her/ whatever, it just said the she suite, SUITE, she suite of pronouns. I really liked that. I thought that was really elegant. I haven't changed my email signature. I have seen really cool things where I know a professor who has her pronouns and then says like, not sure what this means. And it's a link in her email signature to something about pronouns, which I think is really cool. So if you have control over your email signature, if you are in a space that allows for these things, and I apologize if this all seems like if you're like, I've done all these things, I'm so sorry. But if you haven't thought about adding it, these are things that take a minute. We are all busy. We are all teaching a lot of people. So just something else you could be thinking about. Your online identification. The first thing I did when I logged onto this Zoom call is went to rename and added my pronouns. I do it for everything. I do it when I log into a yoga. All my Zooms have my pronouns in them. So it's not just when I'm teaching. It's when I log into a board meeting for my daughter's school. It's when I log into yoga class. It's creating this idea that this is just what we do. And I've had people say to me, I'm going to do that. I really like that. And if that's the only time someone ever thinks about a pronoun, I think that is a win. So Google Classroom is a little clunkier, but this is how you would do it on Zoom. Actually, it's gotten much easier on Zoom. I see another. Let me see if this is sound too. Okay. I answered your question. Ooh, dismiss. That feels so abrupt. I don't want Sal to feel dismissed. There we go. Visual cues. On my D2L page, I just have this. So you can go to the GLSEN. I think that stands for gay, lesbian. I'm not sure. I'm not even going to pretend. But this is a place where I often go for resources. They have all these little things that you can just copy and paste. I don't make this a big deal on my introduction page, or so I either have it as part of my introduction page online, or I might just have an announcement that just says like, my pronouns are she, her, hers. That's it. Visual cueing, it's just there. Just part of the air that the students breathe when they're with you in the classroom or online. I have a little pin that's on my school bag with my pronouns. That's it. And students or people who are looking for it will see it. And our students, especially our trans students, are looking for it. They're looking around to see who they can trust very quickly. So those little visual cues might be lost on 99% of the students you're teaching, but the 1% who's looking for them are really going to see them. I can hear my family, so they're doing a great job of being quiet. I'm sure some of you can feel that. I wanted to put this here as well. So something I do in a physical space is I will often, when I get to class, I will put up on the screen. If anybody else lost vocabulary in COVID, you are not alone. So when I get into a classroom, I might project an image on the screen that's just there when my students walk in. When I taught high school, oh my gosh, I had so many posters in my classroom. Yes? Are you for real right now? I'm talking to like 100 people. Oh, thank you. So I know a lot of you feel that very seriously. So my classroom that I would always be in had a bunch of posters, but when you teach college, you move around. So I would just project things. And Teaching Tolerance has these great digital images. Well, actually, they're called Learning for Justice now. They're One World posters. They're all these really cool images. Students might just walk in and see this on the front screen as they walk in. It's again, quote from Laverne Cox. She is a trans actress. Some people might just look at this and say, oh, that's a really nice quote. But other students might look at this and say, whoa, like this teacher is projecting a quote from Laverne Cox. And I put that teaching tolerance issue 50 was only about these issues. So if this time with us together is just the beginning of something you're more interested in, that would be a great place to go and download that complete issue of the magnet. I'm really proud that I have written, I remember reading Teaching Tolerance in the 90s when I was becoming a teacher. So I'm really proud that I have written for them and worked with them. And so, you know, just these visual cues that we can offer up. Some other things that I added this year that I had never thought about before was creating a resource page. So on every single class that I teach online, you know, there's like the start here and the syllabus, there is a resource page. And that resource page has the line for the Trevor Project, has very specific outreach within the campus and beyond. And I show them this. And I say, you know, this, you could use this for this isn't for class. This is so you know that if you need something, you can go to my page and you can find this resource page. You don't have to Google things. You don't have to look for things if you're in crisis. Go to my page, just like I hope you would go to me. You can go to my page. Here are the resources that you might need in that moment. So again, I have no idea if any student has ever used them. But this is a class about signaling allyship. I hope they did use them if they needed them, but I don't know. I have no idea. I guess I could go and see if anybody's clicked on it, but you know, that's something you can do. Zoom backgrounds, I find to be a little clunky, but I'll show you a few and then some other things that we can do. Oh, here's my resource page, sorry. So here is my resource page. It has developed over the year. This is when I first made it. You can see at the bottom, there's the explicit stuff from the Trevor Project. I have the Women's Center, the LGBTQ Center, and again, other things on campus, making this just part of their academic experience, not like singling out, but just, you know, while you're on campus, someday you might need the Writing Center, and you might need to go to the LGBT Center, or you might need the counseling services. You know, that these are all parts of life instead of feeling like elements of our experiences are marginalized. There are so many free Zoom backgrounds that you can use. And what I did is I created a folder of them. I also had some Black Lives Matter. I see a question. Yes, so the Trevor Project is a suicide hotline, but right, like adding RAIN or something like that, anything, I think just having that resource page, whatever you think is helpful is going to be helpful. But yes, develop that resource page absolutely as you wish. So Zoom backgrounds, so I created a folder of them. I had some Black Lives Matter ones, you know, again, the intersectional approach. They weren't all LGBTQ focused. So I will say this, like I find Zoom backgrounds to be really distracting. So what I would do is I just had them on as students were coming in. So as students were coming in, they would see this. And then when I kind of wanted to get down to the content business, I would just turn it off. It's not that hard. It was just another way to show my students that that I'm there. A lot of visual cueing when we are in virtual spaces. So, you know, you can decide how you feel about things like this, but I have taught long enough to know that anything that can get kids' attention I'm going to do it. And I taught seniors when I taught high school, and they loved stickers. They loved all these things that they're, you know, supposed to be too old to love. And I absolutely know that students love stuff like this. I know it's silly and it's goofy, but again, it's an easy, fun way to visually cue. I think Bitmoji are a really fun thing to do. It's just an app on your phone. And I would actually, when I was teaching online and like every day there would be something, there was always a Bitmoji that had something to do with me being an ally of some sort, having to do with something. So, if you don't know what Bitmoji are, you could check out the app. Well, you'll see in a second. I always have this one, the she, her pronoun. But right now it's Pride Month. So there's all these great Bitmoji with all these different ways to signal that you are an ally. So I would just, again, this took like 20 seconds. I would just open the Google, it's a plugin on Google. I would find one. You can see my shirt says Pride right now. Sometimes my shirt says Black Lives Matter. Just anything for my students to see that I have some whimsy. I love whimsy. And that also I'm thinking about these issues. So check it out, especially right now because Pride Month. And these are always there. You can search them, but these are some of the ones that are for Pride Month that I've used many of them just at the bottom of the announcements or at the bottom of an email, just to be fun, right? Just anything to like lighten the mood. I see the question. So you're all being so patient because I've never had this webinar set up before, so I'm not as used to it. So I think you could just type in BITMOJI and it will be the first thing that comes up. It is also an app on your phone. And the other nice thing about Bitmoji, and I'll show you in a sec, is you can make your own, like if you wanted it to say something specific, you could do that. But again, just something, anything. Some of you, if you're using Google Classroom, you might actually be, this is like oh, let me see, there's another question here. No, I don't have students offended by what I do, but I want to circle back to the thing I said before, where I'm a director of women's gender studies, sexuality studies at a university. So I know that that's different. I am friends with many and married to a secondary ed teacher. And I know that some places it's really hard to navigate that. So, if somebody's going to get mad at your Bitmoji wearing a trans shirt, and I know that that's a thing. So this Bitmoji classroom is just something I was throwing together. I actually did find plenty of secondary teachers who did have things, but even here, I'm trying not to be too finding that fine line, right? Doing the dance. I think just having your pronoun sign is probably okay. This is you can find the library symbols in all kinds of different colors. You have to know your climate. And I am very aware as a director of WGS that I can do a lot of things that people may not like, but they're probably not going to say it to me. But when I taught high school, I did plenty of things people didn't. But the students that needed to see it saw that I was doing that. So, you can decide how you want to use these things. And that, for me, is the end of me talking at you. And I appreciate those really good questions. So I will stop the sharing and I will be here. Are they able to just unmute and ask a question on a webinar? Or can you help make this happen?
So because it's a webinar, I can't have it set up for them. I have to make people presenters or co-hosts.
Oh, okay.
The Q&A, so they can, if you have that up, people can, if you have any questions right now, because we have plenty of time, so this would be a perfect opportunity for it. Post some questions in the Q&A. We'll be able to, looks like one just came in. So it looks
I see that. And so Eileen suggested having students write their opening introduction in third person so I can see the pronouns they use. I love that. I'm going to write that down. See, this is how we all learn together. I'd be curious if Eileen is willing to type more, how that goes, or how, you know, what the response to that has been. Third person. It's a great lesson in person too, right? First person, second person. So that wasn't a question. That was just me saying that's a great idea and I'm totally stealing it. So I'd also be really happy to see what other people are doing, because this is just like stuff I came up with. This is not the end all be all, I'm sure. Okay. I think there's no more questions right now, but is that right? Okay.
Yeah, they're in right now. Oh,
Works well, never had any issues. I teach international students. That's a great idea.
awesome.
Okay, so Stephen asks the very important question, because I teach 30, right? So I teach at a teaching university. So I usually have 30 students, 4 classes, 120 students. I make myself a cheat sheet list and I look at it before class. There's nothing, and sometimes I mess it up. And sometimes I mess it up. But that I have no more elegant answer than I write. I sit there and I look at the surveys. I make a cheat sheet of like the 2 or 3 students that the answer is different, you know, that maybe they've indicated that they're trans, or you know, their pronouns are different. I make a cheat sheet for the first week or 2. I'll peek at it before class starts. And that's it. That's the magic. I was also thinking of having my students write about themselves, but then swap pronouns. And that would be a really interesting exercise, right? Like I don't know if everybody can see this. So, but Martina wrote that, you know, just playing with that, playing with pronouns as language. You know, most kids have never thought about pronouns. So although kids more and more have this in their, you know, I mean, Facebook now, you can choose like 52 gender identities. Like this is just part of the world now. So for them, they have thought about it and then stopped, you know, this is part of their lives. But that is an interesting idea, Martina, to just write it 3 ways, write it with she, write it with he, write it with they, and then respond to what that's like, would be a really interesting exercise. So Tracy puts a really good point up here, and that word preferred, right? So I used to do that too. I used to say, what is your preferred pronoun and what is your preferred name? And I was at a seminar with our local LGBTQ center, and the person there who was trans said, I don't like the word preferred, because this isn't a preference. This is my pronoun. It's not a preference. And that really helped me. Again, I thought I was, you know, we're always evolving, always changing. So I shifted my language. I got rid of the word preferred because I really heard what he said. And he was adamant. This is not about preference. This is about who I am. So I think just thinking about that, the use of the word preferred there, about 4 years ago, I just reassessed and thought it's actually easier to just say pronouns. But I was right there with you. And holy cow, a professor in the 90s asking that is incredible. That's amazing to me. And this is what I'm talking about, like this long arc of a teaching career, watching this change. So the Philippines, I would love the idea of non-gender specific pronouns. So I also speak French and sometimes teach French. And boy, does that get really complicated because everything's gendered. I mean, at least in English, really only our pronouns are gendered. But suddenly when all language is gendered, it really creates, it really creates problems. So I'm fortunate that anything that can be gender specific, I think is much easier. Gender choice trumps gender is identity. Let me see if I understand this. How can you respond to this to give cisgender its due and transgender? So I think, I'm not sure I understand that question, but I will say that I am frankly not trying to give anything its due. I am just trying to make everything just the thing. I think that's kind of what you're like, you know, the idea of creating a hierarchy or something like that. I'm fine doing a little signaling to like up the level to equity. And if I didn't answer that, please let me know. But I heard an analogy of whiteness being like a bank account. I want to answer this thoughtfully, so let me read this really carefully. I think it is very important for people to use their privilege for good. That can mean a lot of different things. That needs to have safety held into account. I mean, I have a ton of privilege, right? I am well off now. I am white. I am cisgender. I am heterosexual, right? Like, to me, doing things like this are part of my allyship. So folks who are in positions of marginalization in those positions are not always the ones being asked to do it. So to me, very much, again, that intersectional approach, to me, all of this work looks very similar. And knowing where we stand in one position, you know, it's like when my male colleagues bring up the fact that it is clear that there is a gender bias in promotion, right? All the women can be screaming about it. But when men also say, this is actually a problem, it really feels great. It really feels wonderful. So I think that answers Meredith's question. Oh yeah, the J.K. Rowling thing. I'm also having this with a writer I love right now, Chimamanda Adichie. So many of my students feel betrayed without understanding what she wrote. Oh, this is a big question. So I've been saying this my entire teaching career, that you can value work by somebody that you do not agree with. Like I, you know, in the 90s would use the example of Robert Frost. I was like, Robert Frost was a total jerk. But his poetry is amazing and we can still value it. So that's always been my party line. Like we can still, the way I say it to my students is like, we can get pleasure from things that are problematic. You are not a bad person if that happens. Some people would disagree. Some people would say I'm a bad person, that I can only consume things by people that aren't problematic, but we're humans. So the J.K. Rowling thing, you know, she's so precious to so many. And the DJ thing too, if anybody knows, I'm thinking, yeah, if you haven't written or misread the author, I wish people could talk to me because it's hard for me to understand through text. I'm curious, Stephen, like how, if you're willing, it would help me to know kind of how you feel about this. This is one all I can do is talk about I have students that have disavowed J.K. Rowling. They are like, we're done. They're devastated. They really feel like they've lost something in losing Harry Potter. My argument would be they don't have to lose Harry Potter. But maybe I'm being naive when I say that we can separate the work from the person. That's what I would say to them. I have said these things. So, oh, you're just literally asking me what I think J.K. Rowling means. Okay. So thank you, Mark. Thank you for feeling me. It's really hard right now. But I also think people are and I also I want to say this, I love the work by Chimamanda Adichie, and I love the work by Emezi. I am actually the person who reviews all of Emezi's work for World Lit Today. So I'm like deeply embroiled in this conflict right now because I love the work of both of them. I think both of them are being misconstrued, sometimes willfully. I've had the tab open to the Adichie blog and I haven't had time to read it because I know it's really long. So I appreciate your sympathy. So back to J.K. Rowling. So here's what J.K. Rowling stepped into, though. So there is that branch of really kind of second wave feminists that always thought women were better than men. I have never been of that. And we are all, my argument is all like, we are all human, we are all flawed. She kind of stepped in. So the term for somebody who ascribes to that is like trans exclusionary, revolutionary feminist. I think that's what that sounds like. So her argument very much sounds like the argument of somebody who ascribes to feminism but excludes trans women from that. The argument often being like, well, you were a man for so long, you experienced that privilege, so how can you really ever understand women? You know, there's a lot to that TERF argument, and TERF is not like necessarily a nice term, so I don't want to, it's a hard one. J.K. Rowling, I mean, you know the answer to this, Stephen. People are not reading for nuance these days online. So it's very easy to, it was interesting to watch how that went down. It was interesting to watch all the writers that did that page in the New York Times after that. I will often say, I mean, J.K. Rowling is ridiculously powerful. She doesn't care what I think about her. She has tons of privilege, tons of money. And if some people who are marginalized and oppressed feel like she's not being kind, I'm going to listen to them. Just like I'm going to listen to Emezi, even though, thank you, Mark. Even though I'm going to listen to Emezi, even though they, their pronoun is they, even though they, you know, it's so complicated. Like it's, none of this is easy. But what I will also do, because my students know I love Chimamanda Adichie and they know I love Emezi, and I know when I get into the classroom in the fall, I'm surprised none of them have written to me asking about this. So yeah, here's what I say to my students. I just tell them, I'm like, I'm very conflicted. I don't have an answer to this. I will probably just keep reading them both. And maybe I won't be as much, I mean, 15 years ago, I was a big champion for Emezi's work. I'm sorry, Adichie's work, because 15 years ago, nobody was reading a woman from Nigeria. So, you know, but now she has a lot of power and a lot of prestige. So I'm inclined to kind of listen to the person who doesn't necessarily have that much power and privilege. But I appreciate you feeling that, because it's actually a really hard thing going on right now. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm really sorry. But in the literary world, there's like this huge thing happening right now that's basically mimicking a lot of the J.K. Rowling bigger controversy that happened.
All right, so it looks like we don't have any open questions right now, and we are actually up on our time. So
fantastic. Well, thank you all for spending an hour with me. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you for the presentation. That was absolutely fantastic. And I want to say thanks to everyone who attended and who contributed at the end here. That was an awesome discussion to end with. So I always love seeing that much feedback coming in. So one other thing I wanted to mention was that if anyone watching today or any of your fellow instructors are interested in presenting like Colleen did today for one of our future Learning and Growing webinar series, please submit your proposals to the Learning and Growing website, and I'm going to paste that into the chat now and make that available so everyone can see that. So give me 1 second. Make sure I do this properly so everyone can see it. Let's see here. There we go. I should be able to see that in there now. But on that note, so if you do have anything to submit, please do. Also, if you have any questions at all, please direct them to us at marketing@hawkslearning.com, and we'll be emailing a link to view the full recording of this webinar, once it is available in the next few days. But on that note, I'm going to say once again, thank you to Colleen. Thank you to everyone who attended. And everyone has a great day.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. And thank you for all of your help. It's nice to have a moderator.
Absolutely. Happy to help. Have a good one, everyone.